Under no circumstances would Jewish people now entrust their lives under a Nazi regime, given the horrific history of the Jewish Holocaust. That shared history between the Jews and the Nazis resulted in Jews never entrusting their lives to Nazis. However, to the contrary, although the African Holocaust lasted hundreds of years longer and resulted in millions of more deaths than that of the Jewish Holocaust, many Black people reveres our oppressors in spite of that brutally horrific history. Millions of Black people also now blindly accept all information that we receive from the white society as being true, in spite of their history of deceit. Throughout history, the oppressors have demonstrated an entrenched predisposition for deceit that matches their proclivity for racism. They've always told us lies. The oppressors have in fact told so many lies throughout history that falsely favors themselves that the term whitewashed was created based upon their racial group's proclivity for telling lies. Yet in spite of the notorious deceitful history to the contrary, millions of Black people now blindly accept all information that we receive that comes exclusively from white sources. We revere it as being the absolute truth. These profound contradictions clearly demonstrates that millions of Black people are not perceiving the white society based upon an accurate interpretation of the true histories shared between all two racial groups. The reason for this profound contradiction is not some strange phenomenon. It's by deliberate design. It's always by deliberate design whenever the oppressed starts thinking exactly as their oppressors wants them to think. And it has absolutely nothing to do with a silly slave syndrome myth. That silly slave syndrome myth presents what would in fact be the least effective and least plausible method used for controlling generations of millions of people. It's simply not how true brainwashing is achieved. We must gain a clear, concise, and accurate understanding of our plight, condition, and situation in order to liberate ourselves. Because if our understandings of our plight, condition, and situation are flawed, then all of our liberating strategies and remedies that stem from those misunderstandings will also be flawed. This is why those of us who know the truth must teach African proverb. Here's the truth of our plight and condition and the situation that we're currently in. Unlike at the conclusion of World War II, when the less than 12-year Jewish Holocaust came to an end, and the U.S. government and the United Nations contributed massive financial support to rebuild their lives. They even ordered Germany to pay reparations to them. However, there was no moral obligation to do the same for we Africans. Although the African Holocaust lasted hundreds of years longer, resulted in millions of more deaths, and more greatly decimated the African culture, when slavery was abolished, the US, the UK, and many other white nations that grossly exploited Africa felt no moral obligation to restore the lives and culture of Africans. They instead focused on their own self-interest by instead socializing Africans. Socialize is when the oppressors exploit their monopoly over information that are systematically fed into the minds of the oppressed to manipulate the oppressed to think and behave in ways that serves and protects the interests of the oppressors. Regardless of how intelligent people are, if it's possible to control the information that people receive, it's entirely possible to control what they'll believe and how they'll behave. This is all possible because people's beliefs and behaviors aligns with the information that they've been taught. The white society exploited its monopoly over information that Black people receives by feeding us lies by feeding lies into our collective minds that makes us think and behave in ways that benefits the white society. White social science scientists call the process socialize. They describe the process as merely instilling a value system into the collective minds of the black masses that makes us adhere to the authority and the existing infrastructure of the white dominant society. It's how the white society protects itself from massive unified black retribution, given its long history of brutally exploiting black people. If you think that this is some silly conspiracy theory, it's because you don't know true history. Throughout history, those empires that were brutally oppressive, fearing eventual acts of massive retribution from those that they brutalized, have always prevented such acts of retribution by manipulating the minds of the oppressed to think in ways that prevents them from unifying and seeking retribution against their oppressors. This practice was never abandoned. This is precisely what the white society has done to black people. Through their monopoly over the information that are fed into the collective minds of the black masses, white social scientists and white propagandists have socialized millions of black people to think in ways benefiting the white society. There are 4 ways to effectively socialize an entire generation of people: by what we're taught, by what we see, by what we hear, and through repetition. Because the white society controls the education we're taught, the media images we see, the societal narratives that we hear, through repetitive propaganda programming, they've socialized millions of black people to think in ways that are against our own interests and in ways that serves and protects the interests of the white society. It's the true reason why many black people now perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies and reveres our oppressors in spite of such a brutally horrific history of the contrary. Whenever the oppressed starts thinking and behaving exactly as their oppressors wants them to think and behave, it's always because they've been socialized to do so. People that have been socialized rarely, if ever, learn of this fact. This is now the case in regarding black people. Most black people are totally ignorant of the fact that they've been socialized. Because of this ignorance, many therefore assigns a silly slave syndrome myth to our condition and a biblical fairy tale to our plight. Whenever people are ignorant of the truth, they'll always believe nonsense. The truth of our plight and condition is that because the white society controls most of the information and media images that are systematically fed into the minds of black people, they've exploited this scenario and this immense position of power to socialize the collective minds of black people to think in ways that serves and protects the interests of the white society. More specifically, presently, white government agents that specialize in psychiatry and propaganda works unrelentingly behind the scenes, manipulating the collective minds of the black masses. These men analyzes and studies everything about the black population: our beliefs, our likes, our dislikes, our strengths, and our vulnerabilities. This surveillance information is gathered, and then decisions are made on which fraudulent stories to produce to best create certain psychological feelings amongst the black population that assist the white society in maintaining their control and dominance over black people. These men govern our minds, molds our opinions, and shapes our perceptions in ways that protects and serve the system of white supremacy. These men are the true reasons why many black people now reveres our oppressors and perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies, in spite of such a brutally horrific history of the contrary. They literally gave their racial group an accurate, favorable image makeover within the collective minds of black people. And then they shifted black collective progressions away from the white oppressive society and redirected it against and towards ourselves. That's why they exaggerate black on black crimes. It turns it against ourselves. This program also attacks the core foundation of what bonds us as a people. And as long as we're kept within this condition, we can then be ruled over forever. It's the hidden truth that white oppressive forces don't want black people to ever learn, because our ignorance of this truth gives them their greatest power over us. Welcome to the real world. The general population doesn't know what's happening, and it doesn't even know it doesn't know. That's a quote from Noam Chomsky. This is the truth of our plight and condition. To not have socialized us would have been directly against the interests of the white society, given their long history of brutally mistreating and exploiting and subjugating black people. To reverse engineer what they've done to us, we must get a clear, concise, and accurate understanding of it. Once we understand how it's done, we can then develop the proper counter strategies to overcome it. It's why those of us who know the truth must teach. The African slaves of the 21st century are those who cannot overcome their socialized minds. It's truly mental slavery. Those black people who don't critically think never notices their mental chains. It's the real black people's matrix. I'm trying to show you the truth in order to free your mind, but I can only show you the door. You're the one that has to walk through it. One love and peace.